Thanks for joining me today, guys. Anthony Turnham, professional photographer here, and today we're going to be looking at a landscape edit in Luminar AI. Now, you and I both know that Luminar AI has the capability just with one click of a button to apply a whole template, analyze your image, and give you a brand new look. And that's really cool. But what if you want to take a little bit more control and finesse yourself? Well, for me, that's where the fun of photo editing actually exists. So in this photo editing video, what I'm going to do is select a landscape photo and walk you through my process as I go through all the tools, decision making, what I'm including, what I'm leaving out. Now at this point, I'm not even sure which photo I'm going to edit. So to aid me in making that decision, I've got a really neat technique that I'm going to share with you. And it basically allows me to create a really rough and ready edit that allows me to see what that particular photo file has the potential of. So without further ado, let's boot up Luminar and get editing. So within Luminar AI's catalogue here, I have a whole heap of unedited raw photos that are some landscapes I photographed going around the North Island of New Zealand. And if I come down here to the bottom right hand corner in Luminar and click on that eye tool, you can actually see some information about the photos. And right here you can see I shot this on the 30th of September 2020. And now we're in 2021. This just breaks my heart that these photos are all sat here unedited. So if you're anything like me, you probably have a whole heap of photos sat on your hard drive as well, unedited, and it's just so frustrating. But that's why a tool like Luminar AI is just so powerful and so helpful for us as photographers, because it allows us to edit our photos so much quicker than traditional methods, particularly tools like Photoshop. So as I scrolled through this collection, I'm thinking to myself, I really am spoilt for choice as to which photograph I'm going to edit. But some of the photos, let's say in particular these ones here, they have so much contrast in them that it's actually hard to get a feel for what the finished photo could look like. So what I propose we do is we're going to do a really quick fix on the whole folder. We're going to use a couple of really simple tools in Luminar AI that are just going to help boost up the shadows, allow us to see the potential that's within these photos. And from there, I can dive into a more refined edit of one that I particularly like. So let's open up this image here, because we've got so much dark shadow going on here. It's almost black and you just can't really see what's going on here. I know for a fact that there was a lot of detail in this cliff face here, a lot of detail where the water was pooling in down here, and I want to be able to see it. So let's come into the edit section, and all I'm going to do is simply come up to Enhance AI, grab the Accent AI tool and push it all the way to 100. Boom, straight away we can see everything that's going on there. We can see what the file is capable of. Another useful thing to do is just jump into the light section, grab the shadow slider and just boost that a little bit. Like if we go to 100, it's just a little bit too much, a little bit too far, almost looks like kind of that nasty version of HDR that some people do. I do hope you're not one of them. And we'll pull those highlights down as well. I tend to like a brighter image, but I don't want to play with my exposure at this point. So what I might do is just boost the center of the curves up just ever so slightly. So I'm just raising the midtones of the curves. You can see if I pull this point up, we brighten those midtones, and if we pull it down, we're darkening everything. So what I want to do is just boost them up just a little bit. Maybe pull a point here which represents the highlights to this top right hand side. You see the clouds there getting bleached out. If I push that up, if I pull it down, we start to protect them. If we go too far, obviously that's not good, but we want to just pull those down just a little bit. I know that I shot all of this on the same camera as well, so I'm going to apply a camera matching profile. And we'll go for camera standard. That might be a little bit too punchy, so I might actually just try camera neutral. And I prefer more neutral profiles because that allows us as editors to actually introduce the contrast ourselves rather than relying on the profile to kind of do it in a bit more of a heavy-handed kind of way. Like there, if I go for vivid, you may feel like that's more dramatic and spectacular, but at this point, that's not what I want. I just want a good representation of what is in the file. And then if I want to take that photo further, I can. So let's just check our before and our after, and I feel like we've certainly got a marked improvement in terms of realizing what this file is capable of. And now, because I know that the most significant change we made was with an AI based tool, I know that I can apply this edit to every single one of these photos, and the AI edit should be respectful of what is in that photo. So let's do that. Let's come to adjustments, and we're going to copy our adjustments. And just as an example, let's open up this image here, which again has a similar kind of problem. We've got far too much contrast in this photo for the camera to have handled it. But if I right click and I go to adjustments and I paste what we just did, there you go, you can see that all of a sudden we can see the inside of the cave. And while for me this is verging on the almost like unsightly HDR kind of look, I take solace in the fact that I can now see inside the cave and I know that there's detail there. So if I choose this photo to work on and actually finesse it, I don't need to come in individually and start playing with sliders to go, does this photo have enough dynamic range? Does it have enough data for me to do a really nice edit? I can see that it does already. So let's jump back to our catalog. Let's press Control A on the keyboard to select all the photos. We're going to right click or Control click on the Mac, and we're going to come to Adjustments, Paste Adjustments. And now, just like that, those edits that we just made should be applied to every one of these photos. And it might take a little while for Luminar to go through and actually crunch all that data on all of these photos, but you can now start to see that thumbnails are actually updating. And I'm making an educated guess on this, but I believe that if you were waiting for Luminar to do the full calculations on your full file size, and if you look at mine, I'm down here in the bottom right hand corner, we can see that these are 46 megapixel files. I know that my camera is shooting in 14-bit RAW. There is a lot of data to be crunched right here. And so I think that Luminar is actually working on a slightly smaller version and almost giving you a hint at what it might look like rather than the finished result. So now I feel like I've got a better representation visually of these photos. I'm in a better place to judge which one do I actually think has the makings of a nice photo. This is really hard. I feel like I'm spoilt for choice. Let's scroll up again. Okay, decision made. I am going to work on this photograph here. And now you can see Luminar has applied those edits like the accent AI. So I literally just made a video on why I think Luminar AI is a really good choice for new photographers. And so just speaking to you guys quickly, I think it's a really good idea if before you start editing your photo, just have a look at this little eye tool here and just start to get a feel for the settings that were involved in particular photos. So I shot this at ISO 200. Which means the file is going to be quite nice and clean, not too much noise in the shadows. The higher the ISO that you shoot your photography at, the more digital noise you're going to introduce into the file. So this one should be pretty clean. I know that I shot this at 19 millimeters of the focal length, which isn't a standard focal length, so you know that I used a zoom lens to take this photo. The 0 here represents the fact that I trusted the camera's exposure and I didn't adjust it in any way. I shot at f16, so I have a very small aperture on my camera, so we should have a good amount of sharpness from front to back. And the final number here is probably the most interesting setting and the most important one for defining how this photo looks. That 118S indicates that my camera's sensor was exposed to the light in this scene. It was open for 118 seconds. So basically we have got the passing of 2 minutes captured in one photo. So basically that's why we've got all this smeared cloud here. I've got a bit of movement in the cloud. We've also got movement in the boats here as well. And that's not ideal. I would prefer movement in the cloud, but not in the boats. So let's dive into the editing. And the first thing I'm going to do is come to the history and just select original. I have reset everything and you can see here how those changes that I made before literally transformed this photo. Without that initial edit, I wouldn't have known that all that detail existed here in the shadows. So I will be bringing a lot of that back, but I want to do it in a more refined way. So let's come to our editing section, come to Enhance AI, and I always like to put some accent AI into my photos. It is such a powerful tool that I don't think it should be overlooked and probably should not be used at 100%. But in this case, if I turn it off and put it all the way up, it's actually doing a pretty good job. So maybe we'll put that somewhere around that sort of 60 mark. We can always add a bit more later. Okay, let's come into the light section here and let's just start to boost the exposure up. Okay, so if we push it all the way to the right, we can see that we've got detail in the grass and in the tree, but we're blowing out the highlights in the sky. So that's not what we want to do, but it's good to know that that detail in the shadows is there. So let's certainly boost the exposure. And now let's come to our shadows and we're just going to start to increase those to a point where I feel like we've still got that essence of evening light, but we are introducing some details around here. Now, while we've got many tools for working with color balance, I think that using the temperature slider and just having a little play to see what effect you get as you move that to the right and to the left, I think that's a really good place to start. Adding in a little bit more magenta rather than green, I think is a nice way to enhance that evening feel. So I do like the idea of taking this photo more towards that bluey purple kind of hue. And with that in mind, I'm thinking that the green is kind of bugging me, so I need to sort that out. But before I get there, let's jump into the structure and let's push that to 100 and see what it does. Now, I quite like what it's doing with the tree here, but I'm not really enjoying what it's doing in the rest of the photo. So what I can do is just use the masking tool here. I'm going to add the mask, use the paintbrush, maybe just work at sort of 30% and just build it up. I'm using my right bracket key to increase the size of my brush. And now just by layering this in, I can start to add in some of that structure. If I reduce the size of the brush now using my left bracket key, I might just paint some over this background area here. And now we've done that, let's just have a look at our before and our after. Okay, we're really moving in the right direction, in my opinion. One of the things that I think is really important when you're working on any edit is to have a rough idea of what you're wanting to achieve. If you have no idea what you want to achieve, then coming into the template section and trying some of Luminar's templates and just getting a feel for what's possible, that can be a really enlightening way of just getting your creative juices going and thinking about your image in a new way. But I've got a rough idea where I want to take this. So I'm happy just working in the edit module and just working my way through the tools. The color section here, if I play with the saturation, we can have a look at what's going on. If I push the saturation to the right, I'm really enjoying what's going on with this little pink kind of flare through the sky here. That's really nice. But obviously it's overdoing everything else in the image, and I don't really want to do that. And I also don't want to just mask in this area here, because then I'm going to lose control of the greens, because when I drop the HSL bit down here, which is standing for hue, saturation and luminance, and if you are new to photography, let me just quickly explain that. The hue is basically talking into the actual value of the color itself. So we can push the red more towards orange, we can push it more towards magenta. If I come and play with the greens, you can see I can take that more towards a yellow or push it more towards a cyan. So that's working with the hue. You're also able to work with the saturation as well, which is how intense that color is. So if I take away the green's saturation, you can see it just goes more towards a gray tone. You can double click any of these just to reset them. And the luminance is talking about the brightness of those colors. So that green again, if I push that to the right, we're brightening that green up. So through this HSL drop down within the color section, you have so much control over your image. So I know that I don't want the intensity of this green here. I just feel like it clashes with the rest of the tonality of the photo. So I may just darken it down slightly, and we'll have a lot of information in the yellows here as well. Sometimes when you think you're working with greens, it's quite surprising just how much of the color tone actually exists in the yellow. But I'm darkening that down just so that our attention goes more towards this interesting area of the sky and the water. I'm not going to be leaving my saturation at 100, but it's not a bad thing to do to push it quite high when you're actually working with these changes here, because those changes are magnified and you can more easily see exactly what your changes are doing. So with the saturation, I think I just want to desaturate those yellows ever so slightly, and also the greens as well. And now if I jump into the hues, this is where I may just be able to work with that hue of the sky. And we can come into the purples, and it's, do we want to turn the purples more of a reddy pink, or do we want to push them more towards the blues? I'm liking that blue vibe there, and just pushing that magenta more towards the red. Yeah, I quite like that. But now I'm just going to double click the saturation just so I'm dropping that back to 0. I'll turn those changes off and I'll turn them on, and pretty much at 0 without any increase of the saturation, all you see is we've just darkened down that green. So I'm just going to reintroduce some of that saturation. I'm going to add some vibrance as well, push it all the way to 100 just to see exactly what it's doing. And vibrance is quite a good slider because you can get a little more heavy-handed with that than you can with the saturation slider, I find. And sometimes just adding a combination of the two is quite a nice effect to do. So here's our before, here's our after, and now I'm looking at the grass. I'm thinking I've made that a little bit too dark, so let's just boost that back up. Now we're going to look at the details section, and if you're sending things straight to the web, You don't need to overly concern yourself with all of this because the cameras that we shoot with nowadays have such high resolution. By the time you've downsampled that high resolution to something that's appropriate for the web, the fine sharpening that you might be applying to the full size image just kind of becomes irrelevant. If you're really happy with a photo and you think you might want to print it, I certainly recommend coming in. We're now at 100% and we can see that we've certainly got a bit of digital noise going on. Now, even though I shot this at ISO 200, because this was quite underexposed and basically all of this area was almost black, because I've had to boost that so much, that's why we're getting that digital noise, and we're also getting color representation that I don't find is particularly accurate. So we can certainly sharpen this photo up, and I normally find pushing Luminar's sharpening tool quite high usually doesn't degrade the image too much. It's normally doing a really good job. But if you've got digital noise in your photo, it's going to enhance that noise. So we need to couple the sharpening with the denoise filter. So we're just going to come in and just apply this quite heavily to start with. And you can see by applying denoise, it starts to almost smear the pixels together. And it can be quite nice in terms of giving your image a sort of painterly quality. But for this one, I don't think I want to push it too far. Maybe somewhere around that 26 mark. But the other thing I definitely want to do is sort out the color noise. You can just see some hints of strange bits of color going on here and there. So if I grab the color denoise, push that to 100, and we'll see what that does. Now it's hard to see, so we'll turn that off and we'll turn it on. And I think that's acceptable. So we'll just click that to zoom back out. Now let's jump into the landscape section. I often don't really use these tools that are in here, but sometimes it's good to have a little play with them just to see what they do. See, I've pushed the dehaze slider all the way to 100 because from experience, I know the way that it works. Oddly enough, it starts to add yellows into the highlights. I'm not quite sure why it does that, but we can use it to our advantage. I like that through this area here in the sky. This is without, this is with it. I quite like it. So what we can do is just mask that in. But before we start doing that, let's have a look at golden hour and see what that does. And I really don't like that. That basically works against us, in my opinion, for everything. It's creating quite a ghastly kind of tonality in the sky. The colours there, sorry, the hue is just not very nice. And it's also bringing back all of that colour in the green that we work to get rid of. So let's take that away. Now, foliage enhancer is an interesting one because if I push that to 100, you're going to think the same thing. It's bringing back the green that we worked hard to get rid of. But if we go into our advanced settings, there's the option to change the hue here. Now, I don't know whether this is going to look any good, but basically we can push that green to a different hue. So we could, if we want, push it more towards the yellows and just have it as a little bit of a subtlety there. Turn that off, turn that on. Yeah, it's okay. So let's push that dehaze up for now. And now we can come to the mask and we can just paint this in where we want it. So I'm going to paint it over this bit here, this bit here. Come in and just paint it through there, paint it on that bit. Basically everywhere where it's white and I want to add a little more yellow, I'm just going to paint it over. I wasn't aware of it bringing in any yellow there, but we'll just add some of that. And now I'm just going to make my brush much, much bigger, drop the opacity, and just do a couple of strokes over here just so that it more softly blends in. And obviously we also need to paint that in over the grass as well. Let's push our opacity higher, bring the brush size down with that left bracket key. And let's turn that off and turn it on. That might be a little bit strong. Let's bring the dehaze down a little bit, and we'll also bring the foliage enhancer down a bit too. To help guide our eye to the center of the frame, I'm certainly going to add a little bit of vignetting. Let's do that really strongly. Whoa, Anthony, you've gone crazy. Far too much. I know that, it's okay. I like to work that way just so that I can see exactly where the vignette is, and then I can refine it to the look that I want, potentially even bringing in a bit of inner light. Nah, we won't worry about that. But now I'm happy with it. What I can do is just put that amount back to 0 or thereabouts, and then just ease it back in and wiggle the slider back and forth. And that's a good thing to do as well. Just that kind of back and forth of the slider and just staring at your picture, and it just helps you to kind of fine tune exactly where you want it. So I'm thinking that -30 mark, that's pretty sweet. Before, after, oh, that's really, really subdued. Maybe we'll go a bit further. Before and after. Yeah, we'll go with that. Let's move on to some of our creative tools. I feel like I'm in a good place with the sky, so I don't worry about Sky AI or even adding anything extra to the sky. But let's try some atmosphere AI. I could kind of imagine a bit of low-lying fog drifting across the ocean here. So in the same way that I recommended pushing vignetting all the way, let's do the same thing with fog. It's so much easier to work with it very heavy-handedly, and you can see exactly what's going on. Like, we can see this is not the right type of fog we want to add. So what about layered fog? Turn it off, turn it on. No, that's not right either. Mist? No, that's not right. Haze. Haze is okay, but again, it's not the right one. Now, I envisaged it coming from this background here, like I say, low lying. So why can't I see that? Why can't I get that result? Well, all I need to do is come back to that layered fog and grab my depth slider and crank that up. And can you see there from the background? It starts to push forward, and as we drop it away, it recedes away again. So if you're ever wondering why you can't see your layered fog, it's because you haven't actually bumped the depth slider up at all. So I like to push that quite far. Let's go somewhere around there, and now we can drop the amount. So we've got it positioned where we want, and now we can just twiddle around with that amount slider and just ease that into where we're happy. So now let's just toggle this off, toggle it on. I really like that. Now, for sun rays to look any good, you normally need to have the sun visible in the sky, and then you can position your sun rays directly over the top. Dramatic might be worth a try, and this is something I certainly encourage you to do with Luminar. Just play around. It's such a cool piece of software for playing around because you're not going to break anything. It doesn't matter. And if you make any mistakes, you've always got the history panel so you can just jump back in time. So if we don't like anything we've done, we can just jump back. So let's jump back to Atmosphere AI. And now those changes we made with dramatic are all gone. So mood and toning are going to be so important for this particular photo. In fact, any landscape photo, I think these two tools are really powerful. They're both to do with giving your photo some color toning. And I'm going to leave that until the end. So for now, let's just come into mystical and just pop a little bit of mystical in. And I find this tool really helps to give a kind of dreamlike quality to your photos, and how much you put in of that is, personal preference. I like it. I obviously don't like it at 100. That just looks a bit weird and too much, but somewhere around, 20, 30, I think that's pretty good. Let's toggle it off, toggle it on. Maybe it's a bit strong. We'll ease it off. And as you're making your way through your edit, always come back to the beginning and go, where have I come from? Where have I got to? Where have I come from? Where have I got to? Not quite like that. Let's close down mystical. I don't think we need any glow because mystical and glow actually do similar things. Glow just works more on a kind of highlight zone, whereas mystical works on your highlights and your shadows and gives a softening effect over the whole image. But if you're not a fan of mystical, the Orton effect is a very popular tool for landscape photographers. I'll be honest, I'm not super loving on how Luminar applies it, and I do prefer the mystical filter, but you might like the softer version of the Orton effect. And in this case, I quite like the way it's lifting the shadows slightly. It's just making everything, as it says, a little softer. So let's go with that. And now let's just slide down here. We don't want anything to do with portrait. We could try high key, because although it's in the portrait section, high key I don't think is a portrait specific tool. And if it were me designing the layout of Luminar, I would have actually put it in the creative section rather than the portrait section. But that's just me. So now let's come on over to one of my favorite things to do, and this is the local masking. And as I'm sure you know, this is a powerful place to add specific changes to your photo. So I actually think that the sky is a little too bright up the top here. I want our attention to go more to this brighter area here, so I can locally darken this down using masking. I also feel like we're getting a bit of a weird purpley color cast going on with this tree here. So I can change that as well with local masking. If I was to remove the purple using the global editing tools, it would remove the purple from the clouds over here and the water as well, which I don't want. So let's throw a couple of local masks on. Let's jump to basic, and I'm going to do a gradient mask here, and I'm going to pull down from the top of the sky just beyond the horizon line there, just so it feathers from the top to the bottom. And now I can bring the exposure down. And you can see how that's just applying that to the top of the sky and the tree. I'm going to try pushing the shadows up just ever so slightly because the tree itself is actually getting darkened down quite a bit, and I don't really want that. It's just the sky that I want to darken down. So potentially it's the highlights we want to talk into. So I could drop the highlights down and push the exposure just back up a little bit. Let's toggle it off and toggle it on. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's add another one. Actually, before I leave that one, what I'm going to do is actually just remove that bit of masking from the tree because it is darkening it down quite a lot. So I'll come to the eraser tool and I'm going to use this to erase from that gradient that we just painted before. So this is quite cool how we can double up with our masking basically. Let's drop the opacity and do another layer of painting, and that way we can feather that effect just over that bit of the tree. If we want to paint some back in, we can do that as well. All right, let's jump to this mask here. And I'm going to be looking at the tree itself, and I'm just going to grab the saturation slider and just take out the saturation. Maybe even just a little bit of the vibrance too. Just push that saturation back up. Maybe if we push that towards the yellower tones, we may get a more realistic tree color. So if I turn that off and I turn it on, I definitely think we are getting more realistic brown bark-like tones. And now all I need to do is just get my paintbrush and paint over those purple tree trunks. And if I feel like it's purple up here as well, I can just paint over that area as well. I'm not going to be super precise with this. I'm painting this with my mouse. I would probably normally be working with my Wacom tablet, but in this instance it's mouse only. And then I'll often toggle between the paintbrush and the eraser, and that allows me just to refine the mask a little more and often work to feather it in. So let's toggle that off and toggle it on. It's pretty subtle, but it's just removing that quite purple tinge that we had. Okay, I like this highlight that we've got going through here on the sky, and I just want to see if I can enhance it just with one more mask. So let's add a basic mask. And you have one of two options when you're working with masks. You can either make your changes and you're going to see what you're doing acting globally, and then you can paint that back in just where you want it. Or alternatively, you can paint the mask area first and then make your changes. The way you work is honestly entirely up to you. There's no right or wrong way. For this example, what I'm going to do is actually just work globally and make some changes and adjustments. And I'm just creating like a lighter and warmer toned area. And now when I come to my brush, and all I need to do is just click once, and now I see the original image, and wherever I paint, I'm going to be able to introduce that change that I just made with that mask. And now I'm doing it. I am absolutely cursing the fact that I'm doing this with a mouse and not a Wacom tablet. But you can see that it's just taking that kind of pinky orange hue and just pushing it further along. So let's turn that off and turn it on. I don't love it heaps, to be honest, but the cool thing is you can always come back in and make some changes. Like if you feel like you've been a bit too aggressive, just bring the sliders down, or alternatively just use the eraser to take some of the effect away. We could even try painting some of it in along here as if it's reflecting in the water, and just brightening that up as well. I really feel like I've gone too far with this edit at the moment. If we look at our before and our after, things are just looking a little surreal at the moment, but it's okay, because what I'm going to do when I've finished my edit is I'm actually going to come back and just reduce the overall amount to a point where I feel happy. So for now, I'm going to carry on working at full strength, and I'll probably just ease it off when I'm done to 70–80%. But now what I want to do is my favorite part of pretty much any image edit, and that is just working with the tonality, working with the colors. Because it does what the tool here says, it adds mood. So let's come in and choose a LUT. That's just a lookup table. As you may be aware, movie industry uses these heaps just to color grade a whole film. But for me, as I pop through these, like San Diego, that's enhancing all those purples. Santa Barbara gives it a bit more of a realistic look than the San Diego. The choices that you go for here can really change the whole feel of your photo. I quite like color punch hot. Let's turn that off and turn it on. And if you're not 100% sure of the changes that you're making with those LUTs, again, what you can do is just be much more heavy-handed. Push it to 100, then come back into this list. And then as you go through them, you get a much better feel for what changes those LUTs are actually applying to the photo. Let's come up to these cinematic toning ones. So now I hover over San Diego, you can see why it was enhancing that blue-purple tonality, because pretty much the whole of the LUT is basically remapping all of the colors towards those hues. So let's click that, take it away, put it in, take it away, and now let's just sort of play around with that until we feel like that's retoning our photo as we want it. We can play with the contrast as well. Do we want it washed out or do we want more pop? And I think in this instance we want a bit more pop. Do we want it desaturated or super saturated? Kind of where it was okay. Now let's jump into the toning. And this gives us the ability to talk into the shadows and talk into the highlights. Similar to how a mood will remap everything for you, the toning will certainly work with the colorization of your photo, but you can say specifically, highlights, I want you to be whatever color. So push the saturation up, maybe not that high, maybe around 50. And now as you move the hue slider, it changes those highlights. So I actually quite like those yellow highlights right there. That's looking quite cool. And the shadows, do we want to really enhance those blues that were there before? And we can look at our before and our after. That's pretty subtle, isn't it? Maybe we just want to boost it up a little bit more, push the amount higher, but when we come to the shadows, just not put that in anywhere near as aggressively. And as I alluded to earlier, Luminar AI is just a lot of fun to play around with, and I encourage you to do that. I'm turning this off, I'm turning it on, and I'm thinking, I don't like what I've done here. I preferred it how it was. So I'm just going to hit the reset button there and leave the toning alone. Now the final thing that I want to do is actually come into curves and do a little bit of playing around with the curves. If you're not familiar with curves and would like to learn more about how to use them, what it all means, just write curves in the comments and I will actually put a video together if I get enough people requesting that. But they are super powerful, honestly. We can pull down the shadows, boost the highlights like this, and when Luminar's applied those calculations, we should see some nice contrast. And with added contrast also comes more saturation as well, so those colors are really starting to pop and sing now. You can also use curves for color grading. They're an extremely powerful tool for color grading. Let me just give you a quick demo. What I can do is actually come to the blues and take away blue from the highlights. And what that's doing is starting to add yellows into those highlights. So as I do that, I actually really like that. You could come into the red section here, and what you can do is if you lift the reds, you're going to add more reds in. And there you can see we've color toned it with a more kind of reddy pink wash. And then if I take that away, it will give it more of a cyan look. Just like that. But I think it's cooling it off just a little bit too much. If you make changes with your curve that you don't like, to get rid of any point you've made, just double click it and it's gone. You can see that Luminar is recalculating this, and it's just taking a little bit more time for Luminar to do that now. And that will happen as you compound change after change, edit after edit. All of those different editing tools have to interact with each other to make the changes to your image. So as your edits get more complex, Luminar unfortunately will take longer to respond. So let's just have a quick look at our before and our after. As I say, if we feel like we've gone too far, which I do feel like we may have just gone a little bit too far with this one, we can get the before and the after slider, and you can just toggle that all the way off and then push it all the way on and get a feel for what that edit is doing and go, how much of that do I want? And in this instance, I want to stick around that sort of like 90% mark. There's no percentages indicated there, but you get my drift. So this is before, this is after. That's my edit that I'm happy with. I just want to do a final thing, which is a crop. So I'm going to come into Composition AI. I'm going to choose a nice panoramic crop. Maybe not quite as tight as that. Let's try 16:9. Pull that up slightly. Now we're going to be putting our third crop line right at the horizon there. That's quite nice. We've cropped out all of those leaves and twigs at the foreground there and got rid of a lot of that grass I don't think was particularly interesting for the photo. I'm happy with that crop, so I'm just going to click the tool to close it down, and Luminar will apply it. And that, my friends, is our finished edit. So this is our before, this is our after. You may not like it, and tomorrow I may come back and look at this and think, oh, like I'm already thinking it's probably too purpley. But that's absolutely fine. That is the joy of Luminar AI. I can come back in, I can make some more changes, whatever I want. It's really easy to work with those sliders. It's all non-destructive. So happy days, happy editing. Well, there you go, guys. We've gone from a dark, underexposed photo to something that we can actually see what's going on, and I've given it a bit of tonality. I'm not super convinced that I actually like this edit that I've done, but hopefully the process that I've shared with you and my thought process along the way, you guys have got some value out of that. If you have, do me a favor, leave me a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you'd like to learn more about photo editing and Luminar AI in general. If you've got any questions or even video requests, please leave them in the comments below. And if you don't have Luminar AI yet and you think it would be a good photo editor for you, I've got a link below with a discount code which is @Sky10, which you're welcome to use. Now, popping up on the screen around me, you'll have the subscribe button. So if you haven't subscribed already, you can click on that one. I've also got a couple of other videos that may be of interest to you. So why don't you go grab yourself a nice drink, sit down and click on one of those. Cheers, guys. I'll see you in the next video.